Hi everyone, here we are again. It's Think Differently Thursday. I'm Helen from the Forge Church, and yeah, lovely to have Emma with me today. Hiya, Emma.
Hello,
Good
nice to
to
be with
have
you.
you. Thanks for joining me. This is slightly unusual, Emma, because so often on Think Differently, I talk to people that sometimes that I know really well, sometimes, people that I know a little bit and I've persuaded them to come and chat to me, but I actually don't know you at all, do I?
No, not at all. This is our first meeting.
It is. So I came across you because you spoke at the Forge on our Culture Shift series, and I think I was hosting the service that day. But of course, as things are at the minute, it was all online and you'd been pre-recorded. I was hosting, so we didn't. Although I kind of felt like I was delivering this service with you, we didn't meet, did we? But I clocked you, and I thought then, I need to get hold of you, and I want to just hear more of your story, and I want to chat to you. So yeah, so thank you so much. I don't know if you want to just like briefly introduce yourself, just perhaps tell us where you are, where's home for you?
Yeah, well, I live in a beautiful part of England, in Bournemouth, on the south coast, and that's not where I've always lived at all. And I've had quite a colourful life. I say colourful; it was actually pretty dark, to be honest. But life's pretty good now, through the grace of God. And
Great.
yeah, just I love cats. I love rugby. I'm quite looking forward to watching the football, and yeah, I'm just a normal kind of person, really.
Great. You've said so much in that introduction, and we'll kind of like delve into that as we chat, no doubt. So you said you haven't always been in Bournemouth. So where was home for you? Where have you come from?
I grew up in Somerset, and then
Ah,
when I went to university, I moved to Wales, which is originally where my family are from. So I've
okay.
sort of moved around a lot. And when I finished university, I lived in Portsmouth. I've lived abroad, running nightclubs, and yeah, I've just moved about quite a bit.
Right. When was the nightclub bit? Was that like after uni?
Yeah. It was,
Ah,
yeah. I mean, it's funny because and this might give away if people haven't heard my story, but I got offered quite a lot of different degrees when I finished my A levels. I did well at school and everything, and I got offered like business studies, sports recreation. I went to Cardiff, and they did all that, and basically they offered me hospitality management. I didn't have a clue what it was. And I asked them what it was, and they said the clinching words for me, which was, formed a 4-year plan of my life. And that was that there was wine tasting on a Friday as part of a degree. So I signed up to it in a shot, and that's what like drew me to Cardiff.
that does sound quite enticing. Come and do our degree. This is what you can do on a Friday night. Um,
Yeah.
so that sounds lovely, and you have certainly lived in lots of beautiful places, all those lovely places on the south coast. Um, and so, if you think about childhood, and if you had to just like sum it up in a nutshell, how was childhood for you?
Well, I was brought up in a Christian home, so I remember as a little kid going to Sunday school and all the stuff, and even like, and I laugh now because I even joined the choir, and it was quite a traditional church, and I was in like a red robe, and we'd do weddings and sing at them and stuff, and but that was just a part of my life. But that for me was my sort of earliest sort of memories. But it was a lovely home. My dad had left when I was tiny. He'd run off with another woman and left my mum, bless her. They were married, and I was only 15 months old, and it was 2 days before my brother was born. So, my poor mum had all that to contend with. And at the time we were in Ireland, and my mum brought us back over here, and so that was sort of my very earliest experience of family, quite loving family, but quite dysfunctional in many ways.
So
And
did you grow up like in a single parent family, or did your mum meet somebody else?
no, she just threw her life into looking after me and my brother, and she was a pharmacist at the time. So she did really well at her studies and her work, and
Yeah.
she provided everything you could imagine. I even remember, as a kid, we'd have beautiful meals, and I'd look at my mum and my mum's plate, and she wouldn't have meat on it or something. She was so sacrificial. She'd give us everything and go without herself. And
Mm.
she's always and still is just the most beautiful woman I've ever met, you know, for how much she gives.
Wow.
But not
Do you
having a
think,
dad, I mean, it did have an impact, you know.
of course, do you think that obviously our childhood does shape us, doesn't it? But in terms of I mean, she clearly sounds like a very strong independent woman because of the position that she was in and the role that she was taken on, you know, in a sense being mum and dad as well, whatever that means. But did that make you a strong woman, do you think?
I think it did to a degree, in some ways, but I also think it really, the experience of not having a father around, it was only a couple of years ago when I actually found him and confronted him
Okay.
for the first time ever, bearing in mind I'm 42.
So was
Um,
there no contact with him growing up?
no,
No.
he completely left and went off with this other lady, and he got remarried and had children, but I tracked him down. But I think I didn't realize how much I'd carried that sense of abandonment so much in my life. And I'd made quite a lot of choices based on that. And even in sort of relationships, you know, meeting people that I kind of knew would leave me, it was almost like that self-fulfilling prophecy stuff, you know. And it was only a couple of years ago when I, like I say, I had the opportunity to go to Ireland and actually turned up on his doorstep, and this man answered the door, and it was my dad. And I, you know what, there's a lot to that story, but the biggest thing for me was to be able to forgive him. And I didn't even know that I needed to do it until I was presented with this. And then since then, I've been so much freer in so many different areas of my life. It's quite mind blowing, you know, how much we can,
Yeah.
as children and growing up, carry things. And I think it did definitely make me feel like I wasn't. I thought my dad, you see, had left because of me. As a baby, you carry the most, you know, and as a child, you can have these crazy ideas that form so much of what you do. And I always thought it was my fault, and then I forgave myself as well, and I feel freer. So yeah.
Yeah, I could talk for a long time about forgiveness. It's like my favorite topic almost,
Yeah.
because I think we often think that forgiveness is about the impact of that on somebody else. But I think the biggest thing about forgiveness is the, like you say, the release yourself and the not carrying this burden. I think
Yeah.
it's so releasing to be able to forgive. I think, yeah, I've seen too many people that are just caught up with bitterness and anger, and yeah, I think there's so much power in forgiveness. That sounds like you've walked a really tricky road with that as well. And
It is, because it's also sort of links into, you know, when I remember growing up hearing God is your father, and you think, well, what's that? Because I've never
yeah,
experienced that. Most of the men
yeah,
in my life have been really unhealthy and definitely not role models to me.
yeah,
So it's an unusual one as well, you know, when we talk about it in the Christian sense, you know.
yeah,
But
yeah,
actually, it to release that, it's freed me up to form my own, you know, enlarge on my own spiritual journey as well, which is, you know,
yeah.
not
Was
to get too deep, but you know what I mean? It's just so
Yeah,
many things.
definitely. Was there an element as well of sounds like, you know, you've really valued your mom and like she's been incredible by the sounds of it. So was there an element in almost wanting to protect her as well? Like if you forgive your dad, did it feel like is that fair on her type thing? Was there an element of that in there at all?
But it's funny because it's probably about 9 years ago or so, I actually found him randomly by writing to a rugby club, because I knew his kids were to do with rugby. And, you know, they wrote back to me with his address. I wrote to him and he ended up phoning me. So I'd had two conversations with him prior to this turning up on his doorstep unexpectedly. And I remember when I told my mom that I'd spoken to him for the first time, and she just wept. It was just like, I hadn't expected that. I didn't expect her to be overjoyed because of obviously what he'd done, but it was almost like, for her, it was like a delayed reaction, because
Yeah,
when he left when we were tiny, you know, she just had to be the strong, you know, mum and dad figure, working, providing for these babies.
yeah.
um, so for her, it's like an ongoing healing journey as well, you know. So yeah, you have to be very sensitive with all those impacts.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, that's really interesting, really interesting. Um, if we like think about this year, it's not even a year now, is it? It's like nearly 18 months of this crazy
Yeah,
year that we've all lived through.
yeah.
What would you say for you has been the biggest impact personally of the year or so that we've lived through of this coronavirus year?
Yeah, well, I'm going to explain a bit more about sort of my story and everything, but I work within the addiction sector because of my own experience. And 18 months ago, I'd had this idea of a charity to help equip churches and organisations to run addiction work and to run it really well, sort of collaboratively and with confidence, you know. And when the pandemic first began, obviously, you know, I've lost a lot of people through that, over nine or 10 people I've known.
Mm.
And it was horrific in that sense. But there was also a loss for me thinking that this charity that was so needed wouldn't get off the ground. But actually, it has propelled quicker than I could have imagined.
Oh, right.
And I think the need for addiction work, given what's happened through the pandemic, because if you think, I was doing a bit of a study before the pandemic hit, and there was a big article I'd read about the pandemic of addiction. This was before I'd even really thought about pandemics in the sense.
Right, right.
And it's sort of like, you know, growing and growing. The way that we're programmed at the moment to be addicted to things like Facebook, social media, you know, that instant gratification. It's not just your typical alcohol and drugs, you know.
Yeah.
And so I was doing this bit of research, and also the biggest factor in addiction, which causes addiction, is isolation and loneliness. So you've
Right.
got this pandemic of addiction with a pandemic of COVID, isolation and loneliness at the most it's ever been. And, you know, addiction has just risen crazily
Right.
because we've gone through so many different stages of it. You know, with food at the beginning, people panic buying, people with
Mm,
food addictions, it was horrendous. You
mm,
know, gambling, pornography, the way we can access everything at home. You
mm.
know, so it's been crazy. But obviously, the last year and a half, I've just worked my socks off alongside my other jobs, and this charity is now in its pilot stage, ready to launch
Okay.
in
Right.
January. So I'm really excited about that. So it's been a hard 18 months because I also live on my own with my cats, and I've blessed them. They've got very codependent. You know, codependent cats is not the best, but you know, it's with everything that's bad, there's always something good. You know, so
Yeah.
that's what I've been holding on to.
So whereas the circumstances we've been living in for some people has kind of halted things or slowed things down or meant things couldn't happen, it sounds like for you actually it's kind of propelled a lot of stuff and moved things forward. And I hadn't, so obviously I knew from the talk that you had or what you'd shared when we had our series in church about addiction, but I hadn't kind of really thought about what you're just saying there, that actually the circumstances of a pandemic, if you've got an addictive nature, I guess, have actually facilitated that. So I didn't know either until you just said that actually addiction has really increased and you've seen lots of people. So do you think that's almost as well people that wouldn't have turned to addiction, but circumstances have just meant yeah that they've either
It's been a catalyst. It's been a real catalyst for many people. In some ways, you know, not coming into full-blown addiction, you know, it's crazy because, like, for some, I think it's just sped it along. So in some ways, it could be a
right,
good thing because it's actually made issues come to the surface. So it's
right,
that thing about bringing things into the light, and then we can work with them.
yeah,
So we've had like a 4 times increase in people coming to us in the one charity I work with. I also run national online addiction courses, which, funnily enough, we talked about doing before this, but then suddenly we had to be reactive. So the recovery course, which I'm involved in the past, the most we've ever had in an in-person course in a church has been like registering for a course. Has been around about 40 people.
okay,
More people come because people just come on the night and things, but with these last 2 courses that we've run during the pandemic, both times we've had over 250 people register on each, which is unheard of. But the platforms that we've
wow,
got now don't work for everybody, but it's also making it more accessible to people
yeah,
to get help. So,
yeah, yeah.
uh,
Yeah, and I guess yeah, if you're doing stuff online as well, people don't need to be within the facility. It can have a far wider reach, can't it? And I think one of the things that I kind of thought when we heard you previously in church was around this idea of, I think, you hear the word addiction, and I think we have preconceived ideas at times, and our minds go to alcohol and drugs. But of course, addiction can be so much wider than that, can't it? And I guess it can even be things that, in the right quantity, are good things. But
Oh,
it can
yeah.
it can be so much. Have you come across, a whole range of addictions over the time that you've worked in this whole sector?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like my primary addiction was alcohol, to the point where, at my worst, I was drinking about 2 liters of vodka a day and just wanted to give up. And that was, about 14 years ago. But you know, prior to that, for me, it was food. It could have been anything. And I think
Mm,
with addiction, it's more about what it does to your mind,
yeah.
and the need to feel in control of something, which actually, adversely does exactly the opposite.
Mm,
But over the time I've worked within this sector, I remember I went to London one day and saw this recovery course running, just to get a feel for it before we rolled it out down this way. And there was a little old lady in the group, and I'm not sure if I shared this on the talk I did
I think you
before,
did,
but
but yeah, go. I like it. Yeah, I
yeah,
know.
just this little lady. I thought she looked like my nan. And anyway, we went around the group, and the women were like saying they were addicted to alcohol or drugs, crack cocaine, heroin, whatever it might have been. And this little woman just said, I've got this habit and it's destroyed my life. And I was like, really? And she said that she'd been married to her husband for 50 years and he wanted to divorce her because of it. She spends all her money on it. And I was just like, what is it? And it was cross stitch, knitting like my nan would have done.
Mm,
And
mm.
I laughed. I'll be honest, I just laughed at her, thinking,
Well,
don't be.
it sounds kind of comical, doesn't it? And so harmless. But
Yeah, and in like you say, a lot of people could do that on
yeah,
an evening and be quite relaxed and it not be an
yeah,
issue. But if you've got that addictive nature, anything can become so obsessive. I met a guy that once he used to bite his nails, and to most people it's not a nice thing to do, but a lot of people do bite their nails.
yeah.
And he literally was so obsessed with it that he would bite his hands to be in red raw. But he got married to this beautiful lady, and they were on honeymoon, and he said it destroyed his honeymoon because all he could think about was when could he go to the toilets. He'd always do it in secret and
Mm,
bite his nails, and he said he wasn't present for his new wife.
yeah,
The
yeah.
things that we see, the way that even um, you know anxiety,
Mm,
sometimes if it's reactive, you can see it as almost like an addictive cycle,
yeah,
because people
yeah.
get so reliant on that feeling,
Yes, yeah.
so much.
I
And
think
gambling, loads of stuff.
I think you had a great definition of it when you were with us. I think you said, um, anything that stops you living life to the full, or takes control or becomes the biggest priority, is addictive and so damaging.
Well, they do think that, about 90% of or more people have a habit, an addiction, or a compulsive behavior that if they were free of, they'd be happier. I'm sure most people do things, that are destructive in their lives,
Mm,
and it's just not your obvious sometimes.
yeah. And so you've shared a bit already, just talking about your own addiction, and you've talked about alcohol. So are you able to look back and see what the path was that led to it? Because again, I think, I'm using your words, I think that nobody chooses this life. Nobody says this is what I want. Um, so are you able to see what it was for you that kind of led to this path?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't. I think to sometimes to overanalyze is quite difficult for people, but for me, it's nice to be able to piece together a little bit of what happened.
Okay.
And accepting I can't change the way it's been, which is a big part of what we use in the Serenity Prayer. Courage to accept the things we can and wisdom to know
Yeah.
the difference and things. But and like you say, no, I've never met anybody that woke up one day and said, today I'm going to become a food addict or whatever it might be. But
Yeah.
I think for me, I wasn't comfortable in my own skin. Whether that be a contributing factor to not having my father around, or I had some abuse when I was younger. It probably links in, but I don't know exactly when that moment was. But for me, it was about wanting to be in control of something when my life felt like it was out of control.
Yeah.
And for me, when I started, the withholding of food, it felt like something that I could own,
Right.
which is like a really distorted view. But that's the thing with addiction, it distorts your view to the point where you feel it's good for you sometimes. And this whole, before I knew it, I was gripped in that addictive cycle. And when I found alcohol, it kind of did something for me that I wasn't able to do for myself, giving me confidence. I felt I fitted in when I felt like the outsider. All these different things linked into it, and it was all lies, but at the time it felt very real. And that the more you do something and the more it feeds what you're searching for, even if that's wrong what you're searching for, it becomes a part of your life to the point where you end up with this addictive nature. That's fed by different things. But I could have got addicted to anything if it changed the way I felt. That's the thing. If it was food, shopping, men, whatever it might be. I remember someone once saying to me they could get addicted to a cheese sandwich if it changed the way they felt. And I'm not saying that flippantly. It's the actual thing, the alcohol, the gambling, the watching pornography. That's the substance. That's more like the thing that comes from the deep inner emotional feeling of not being good enough or lacking something.
So it's about wanting to change the way you're feeling and having some control over something. And I guess it's a gradual thing that gets bigger and bigger. And then presumably at some point you get to a point where you realize this thing now controls me. So it might have been about wanting to be in control, but realizing. So can you describe what that feels like when you identify and acknowledge that this thing is the biggest thing and it's control? I think you said it's like a hole in your soul, I think was one way you described it when we heard you in church. But is that a dark place that you find yourself when you realize this thing is controlling you?
It is, because no matter how many people told me that I was drinking too much, or that, I can recall probably hundreds of times people would say, "You're a nice girl, why did you do that? Can't you just stop? This isn't good for you. You may be an alcoholic," all that stuff. And it just goes over your head. And then I describe it today. I used to say it was like that hole in the soul. Just, I was void. I just didn't know anything. And then for me, I describe it now like a cross-shaped hole that needed filling, because I really feel, for me, having the faith journey I'm on has been absolutely fundamental in helping me to become the person I am today, and which God has created. But it's a lonely walk, and especially when you're battling it, and denial of addiction is something that keeps people back in that for so long. And it's a horrible place to be. There's a saying, because I used to, and I still do sometimes, go to Alcoholics Anonymous just to get a fresh perspective on alcoholism for myself. And there's a saying in their book, it's like that crunch point where you realize you can't live with it and you can't live without it. So for me, I couldn't live with alcohol. It was destroying and killing me, but I actually couldn't live without it because I'd become powerless over stopping. And that for me is that tipping point for being, say, for example, a heavy drinker to somebody that's in alcoholism. So when you're at that point, it's very hard to go back unless there's intervention, whether it be spiritual, the practical of rehabs, or people coming alongside, or in my context, a bit of all of it. I'm greedy. I've got an addicted nature. I wanted it all, but for me, it was, some people just can get it. So I knew a lady that used to run the recovery course with me, and she walked into a church, and God literally just set her free of that craving.
Wow.
And she's not drank since. And I would love to say that's my story, and I know God can do that. But for me, it was more of a practical go away to a rehab and get some, change of scenery, get some really thorough sort of counselling and support. And we're both at the same destination, but coming at it different ways.
And I guess the whole journey will be different for everybody, because the starting point's been different, and the journey, to that recognition and afterwards will always be different. When you're at that point, of seeking help or identifying that it is a problem, how important is it to have folk around you, would you say?
Oh, honestly, I think it's absolutely vital. Doing this on your own, is very, very hard, because you need people to reaffirm that you're on the right path, because your head can just tell you such nonsense. I know it's the enemy trying to like derail me when those thoughts come in, but for someone that's maybe not as aware of that, it's scary, and it's frightening, and it's so easy these days to go back into addiction, for whatever thing, reason, whatever the addiction is, it's just so easily accessible. And actually having people that you don't even need to understand it, but just to journey with people. I describe it like walking with someone. I think I read something once that if you've got like one person supporting you, you're like 30 times more likely to do well. So imagine if you've got a team of like 5 or 10 people that are just rooting for you, you're going to do better.
So what's the best way, what does that support look like? So if there are people that are listening and they are supporting people, or even if they're just like concerned about people, what is the best way to support them? Is it to have a frank conversation, or is it just to check in with them? How is the best way to support people?
I mean, I think it depends. Like the hard thing with addiction, like you say, is it's just so cunning and baffling, because everybody is so different, and what works for one person won't work for someone else. And actually, I would always say to try and help the individual with the addiction, to empower them to help make like healthy life choices, because a lot of it's about unhealthy patterns and behaviors and things like eating well, exercise, just talking to somebody. I remember things like people just smiling at me would feel really abnormal, because for so long in my addiction, I didn't even know what color I liked or what food I liked by the end of it, So people to just have an interest, and also not to have all the magic answers, investigate things and options together, having someone to bounce them off and working out the pros and cons. It might be that somebody thinks it's really good for someone to go away to rehab, but actually the reality is that person might have people they really care about locally and would be more concerned if they weren't around there. It's just having these healthy conversations is really important, and helping people to work out where the local help is. And if you don't know, if somebody's working with someone in addiction and they don't know the answers, be honest and say you don't know it, because I used to get really kind of a bit narked when people didn't understand it, but actually now I think, oh, praise God, because if someone doesn't understand it, it means they haven't gone through it, which is what a blessing if somebody hasn't been through it themselves.
And I think that's really helpful, because I think sometimes maybe we shy away because we haven't got the answers or we haven't got the experience. But just perhaps to just be honest and say, I don't know, but still to say, but I'm here and I'll walk this journey with you and we'll work it out together.
And there's such a stigma attached to addiction. It's you if you said to somebody, what do most people think of addiction, you think of a drinker that's unwashed on a park bench, and actually the reality is, in most churches you could be sitting next to somebody that's secretly looking at pornography, or not even in the church, both in and outside, it's everywhere. And just to have people that care, and you don't have to know. I remember, like, I think of it, I'm quite an analogy kind of person, but I went through cancer about 9-10 years ago. And back then, if you mentioned the word cancer, like, it was much different than it is now. And people would be like, oh gosh, and I'm not saying it's a horrific illness, but there's, by talking about it, you get more support and understanding. But it's a bit like addiction. We need to be talking about it more, and more honestly and openly, because so many people suffer from it or know someone that has. If people don't feel comfortable talking about it, that's when they isolate. That's when it's going to get worse. So actually, to have frank and open conversations is really important.
And I guess that's what's so great about the work that you do, that you are raising awareness as much as anything. I mean, I loved it that as part of that Culture Shift series, we talked about addiction in church. Just tell us like a bit more about the work that you are doing.
Yeah, it's funny because, like, back in the day when I went to rehab, I remember the day, and I was so full of anxiety, And God just uses sometimes your biggest fears and flips them around for His good, and that's been my experience. And I hated public speaking. If you put me in a room with more than two people, I'd have had a panic attack.
Really?
So it's just crazy. Like I do talks now in front of like many people, and even directed a TV series before Christmas on the recovery course, and
Wow.
I hosted that and interviewed people and all that stuff, and it's just amazing. But I think for me, it's like He's used all that experience. I call it like using my battles into blessings today. And I just hope that through the work we do, we help to really equip churches and volunteers so that they have an understanding about addiction, not in a too complex, over professional way, but just in a really personal, relational way, just so that they can have those conversations with people. Not just necessarily people they don't know. It could be people in their family, their friends, or even themselves to look at the early sort of telltale signs of addiction and actually do something about it. But we look at it from a whole package, and we look at it through the health side, the well-being side, the mental health side, because that goes hand in hand. So it's looking at it on the bigger picture approach and just equipping people to know a bit more. So yeah.
It just sounds so helpful, really does. And I think, like as you say, several years ago, I think it just all felt a bit more taboo. I think there's a greater awareness now, isn't there? But maybe we still need to learn. I feel like I've got so much to learn about how to begin conversations and how to just be much more aware. And I think this year has meant that people have been shut away so much more, and we haven't been going on into each other's homes in the way that we were previously. And I think that's been quite a difficult time for people. If there are people listening to this afternoon, and they know that, like, deep down stuff has changed in their lives, and that they are an addict in some shape or form, or even if maybe they feel like life is heading down an unhealthy path, what would you say to them, like from your own experience? What would you say to them to do?
I would say it's really hard. I'll be honest, actually admitting that there's a problem. It's really hard, but it's the first big step in order to be able to change it. You might be able to stop that pathway before it gets too bad, or you might be able to get the help before it does escalate. And the thing is, this stuff it's life and death sometimes. I knew somebody, and we don't just mean in the drink and drug sense. I knew a friend of mine who was a gambler who ended up committing suicide because he was just so full of shame and the guilt around it. But it's addressing it and nipping it in the bud before it becomes too big. And or if it is feeling too big at the moment, there are places you can get help. I would talk to people within your close network. Look up the local services that are in the area, but also we run we've got another recovery course starting in September, which is online. So if you went to www.therecoverycourse.com, and the information will be up there soon about how to join the next online course and get the support, because the thing is, you're worth it. Addiction tells you you're not. However, there are people out there and a massive God that does know that you are worth this, and I look back at my life and I remember, I used to cry every night just thinking, I don't want to live anymore, please, I don't want to wake up. And God had a very different plan. I couldn't have imagined a day without having to drink neat vodka. And today my life is just it's beautiful. But that's because people journeyed with me and believed in me until I could believe in myself.
Yeah, I do. I just love your story. It's just so encouraging. Do you think that in a sense it's harder? I use that, I'm trying to be careful about the language I use because I think everyone's story is different. But for Christians, do you think there is an element of guilt, almost like I shouldn't have this problem? I think we've talked about it previously about mental health, almost like sometimes I think Christians think, well, if I'm saying that I trust God and he's got a hand on my life, you know, then I shouldn't be struggling with mental health. Do you think it's the same with addiction? Do you think Christians just feel like shame or guilt, or I can't admit this because this isn't how it should be? And I'm not saying I agree with that, but is that something that you think
I
Christians?
think it does happen a lot, and it's, you know, I used to get it a lot, like, oh, you're a good Christian girl, why are you doing that? Drinking's a sin, all that stuff, you know. And actually, you know, it's hard because we can put such pressure on ourselves, but ultimately we all make mistakes,
Yeah.
and you know, some just if you've got an addictive nature, it happens to be that mistake heads down that path. Other people's mistakes head down a different path. Ultimately, addiction hurts the individual. It is a lot of collateral damage, but it hurts the individual too. It seems like a very selfish illness, but it's actually, like I say, no one chooses it.
No.
And I think within the church, if we spoke more about it, it would really help people to be able to talk about it. But I think as Christians, we can think that we should be a different. Should is such a awful word, isn't it? But it's just the way of the world, isn't it? When people look in at the church, you expect it to be all perfect, but actually it's as broken as anything.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's our human perspective as well, isn't it? Because in God's eyes, you know, no one thing is any better or worse than anything else, is it? But as humans, we sort of almost categorize these things as like, well, that's bad, or this is quite not so bad. This is not the way God looks at us either, is it? Yeah.
No.
So
and I think there's things, isn't there, like, so there's like the shame of addiction can stop people getting help. The people can sometimes not help because they're worried that they're going to get it wrong. But actually, you know, I use the story of, like, I did CPR on my mum back in 2012, and I only knew a tiny bit of CPR, but it was enough to save her life until the people came that actually had the right equipment. You know, you don't know if a conversation with somebody that is literally a breaking point, by just showing them a little bit of understanding, and you don't have to know a lot. You could even say, oh, I watched a podcast the other day, and they were talking about addiction, or I read Prince Harry's article the other week, you know, of him saying that he turned to drink when Diana died. You know, it only takes something tiny bit of identification for someone to then trust to be able to open up.
Yeah, and I think sometimes once you've got relationship with somebody, they feel a bit of like ownership of that relationship as well, don't they? And so maybe again, it helps them with decisions because they feel like, you know, you're going to ask, or you're going to be interested, or you're going to phone tomorrow, and maybe just that little bit of contact helps as well. So you talked about you've talked about faith quite a lot in there. So were you a Christian when you were identifying as an addict, or was that something that you were? So how do those things sit together?
I describe it a bit like, I was brought up as a Christian, but then when addiction really took hold, sort of in my late teenage years, it was almost like addiction formed this barrier to me and God. God was so with me all through it, because there's no way, given the things I did, that I should be here today, given the drink driving, you know, passing out in places, you know, the dangerous, physically dangerous places I put myself in. And, you know, I just feel like addiction is like, it's like that barrier. And that when the addiction goes, it frees up the ability to connect with God. That's why I love it when people get into recovery. They're so full of like this spiritual hunger. And it's just the most amazing opportunity to run, you know, recovery courses or alpha, and people have questions, you know, and people have great questions, and it's wonderful to see. But yeah, it's hard, like when you're a Christian, knowing that you're gripped by something. But ultimately, there is freedom, you know, and the best of people get addicted to stuff. It's all through, like in the Bible, people getting into different things. It's just that it's in a different way that we look at it now.
Yeah. And so you have recovered now, but would you say that you still live with it as a constant battle, or is it something that is just like in the past and doesn't even like play a part in life anymore?
People handle this one a bit differently, you know, like I think it's whatever works for you. But for me, I always have to be vigilant, because for me, I'm like that far away from a drink. So having my sort of armor on, if people understand that a bit, you know, having that defense on, is important. So for me, a big part of my recovery is giving back to others, because that keeps my recovery fresh. And so that's important. It also, sometimes I need to be reminded, like doing this talk today, it reminds me of where I've been and where I don't want to be.
Yes. Yeah.
And also where I'm going. And that's really important.
Yeah.
Having a grateful heart is really key in this. And I'm often, giving thanks for what God's done, and not being complacent either, because it could go in a second if I took my eye off the ball. I mean, I had an incident in January where I became very unwell. I didn't know what it was. I had a stomach ulcer and a hernia diagnosed. And the thing is, I've never had a major problem with prescription medication, but they gave me a load of prescription medication, and my mind was, I had to take it because I was in a lot of pain. But there was a crunch moment where I was like, am I taking it for the effect, or am I taking it for the pain? And thankfully, and this is like, divine timing with what happens, I overheard someone in my home was here, and they were on an AA meeting, and the lady was talking about prescription medication and how it was really cunning. And I just my mind just went bang, I need to stop this, and straight away it was okay. But it's keeping that awareness, because there's lots of ways that we can get derailed.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, that's so interesting. And so how do you keep God central in your life to ensure that nothing else like takes the wrong place again? What are your strategies for maintaining good relationship with God?
I think it's important, like within recovery, to have people, whether it be called a sponsor or an accountability partner, or a few people that you can pray with regularly, you can really be honest with about what's going on, not just around, I mean, I don't get cravings for things, but I can act out, which would be the first step in bad behavior, like anybody can. So it's just keeping in check with people, being honest, and good things sometimes can divert you off track as well. And just, it's not just all the bad stuff, so it's just keeping aware, keeping talking to people.
Yeah, I think that's just brilliant advice, regardless of whether you're struggling with an addiction. I just think we should all have a team of people around us that are just for us, and people that are going to challenge us, the people that we can say just anything to, the people that kind of walk life. I just think it's so helpful, and so such a good path to have in life. If you've got, and I don't think you want loads of them, just like 2 or 3 people that are just know what your stuff is, know what your weaknesses are, and that you've kind of given permission to challenge you if you need challenging.
It's like, I've got a lady called Prue, and she won't mind me saying it, she used to mentor Mike Pilavacci, and she's my mentor, and she lives down here, and she's 90, and she's amazing, and a lot of people think that you're somebody that you have as a mentor or accountability partner. It doesn't matter about their age or their background or anything. It's just if they've got that heart and they're rooting for you. Like Prue has never been through addiction, and she can only identify when she was pregnant and had a craving for avocado pears. She talked to me about that, and it's not the same, but she tried to understand, and bless, but she prays with me and she's rooting for me. And that's so important, and just to have people that care about you.
Definitely. And you've talked about like what your programs are, and what you are raising the profile of and helping churches to understand. But if you could sum up in a nutshell, what is the message that you want the church to hear about addiction? What would it be? Because I think maybe the church, and I speak sort of just like globally really, the church is probably something we've shied away from, isn't it? Because it's been a bit taboo, and it's a bit of an unknown, it's an uncomfortable thing, isn't it, addiction? So
it's messy, it's like, it's not your pretty twee kind of ministry, it's a mess. And we're working with broken people, but you've got to remember the church has got the largest volunteer network in the whole of the UK, probably the whole of the world. And all we need to do is get the confidence to be able to do some more stuff.
Yeah.
So in regard to addiction, it's just be hungry to learn.
Yeah.
Look things up. Go visit some places. There's plenty of places that work within addiction if people are interested to actually meet folk. Ask people their story. Most people in recovery love to tell their story because they're proud of where they've come from. We talk about it more in the church context, and realize that we're all on a journey. Just some people's includes the battle of addiction too. And we're no different.
And I think that's what churches should be as well, isn't it? Churches are not. And I think, often people looking from the outside in have this preconceived idea that churches are full of people that have got life sorted. And I think actually a good church should be full of people that are a bit of a mess and a bit of a muddle and trying to find their way through it, but have chosen to follow Jesus and are just trying to find his way in life. We're not people that have got it all sorted at all, and that can take various shapes and forms, can't it?
And it's funny because I was talking to somebody the other day. I was doing a Bible study, and they're all from London, and they heard a preach the other day. They were listening to it, and it said that Jesus was there for the ragamuffins, and that's quite a London expression. The people that are like homeless, and and it was just like he came for everyone. And we have the ability to help in being Jesus on this earth and actually walking with those folk. And not shying away from it. And it's exciting. It's
definitely. It's been really, really interesting chatting to you. Thank you so much for giving me some time, and definitely you really give us food for thought. You really do. I think just in closing, when you spoke in church, I think you used one of my favourite verses from Mark 10 that says, "The thief comes to kill and destroy, but Jesus said, I've come that you should have life and have it all its fullness." And I think that really speaks into, doesn't it, that like what is stopping you, what is robbing you from living life to the full, because Jesus wants you to live it to the full, but there is a battle and the enemy will try and spoil that. I love that verse, and I take it to heart about living life to the full. What just in closing, what we haven't found out other stuff about you, but what helps you live life to the full? What if you had to say 3 things that kind of really bring you joy in life? What is it that you do or that you love to do?
I love, my banner of a Bible verse for me is Isaiah 61, restoring beauty from ashes and binding up the brokenhearted and things like that. So I really believe in having a banner verse that is your verse that you just grab hold of and you run with. But that's my sort of spiritual bit. I think for me, it's if recovery was boring or not fun, I'd be just still drinking. So for me, it's about having fun and working out what is my life-giving things. For me, going away on holiday in the sunshine and just switching off was one of those things. Haven't been able to do it in a conventional sense, but it will come. And for me, I know it sounds really daft, and this through COVID, I've never grown my own plants. It sounds really, I felt like growing a vegetable patch was boring, or old-fashioned. But actually, I did it last year. I loved it, just seeing something coming to life. I've not been blessed with children, but I love seeing things and birthing things and giving life to stuff. Whether it be helping somebody or with my cats, or with my little vegetable patch, whatever it is, do something that's life-giving and find out what it is for you, because everything's different, and give life to stuff is what I'd say.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's a bit like my daughter. Her bedroom is like Kew Gardens at the moment. She just not only has she got plants and plants and plants, but then she's doing stuff with them and taking cuttings and making more plants. Yeah, it's really lovely, really lovely. Oh, Emma, thank you so much. It really has been wonderful to chat to you, and we've learned a lot, and really you're inspirational. I love your story, which I realise has been really painful at times. but just love the place that you're at. And yeah, clearly life is really good, and that absolutely shines out of you. So thank you for sharing with us. Really
You're
appreciate
welcome. Thanks for having me, and I'll look forward to coming to visit you in person one day too.
it. Great, that'll be fabulous. Thanks again. See ya.
Bye.
Bye.